Are you an early stage founder revolutionizing the future of retail? Then you're in the right place. My name is Sapna Shah, and I'm an angel investor investing at the pre-seed stage in retail tech, e-commerce, marketplaces, and digitally native brands. I'm also the founder of Retail X Series, an ecosystem to help early stage founders in the retail sector. Retail X Series includes events, a YouTube channel, a Slack community, resources for founders, and this podcast. And in this podcast, I interview founders, investors, and experts in the retail space, and we dig deep into the tactics around key topics that early stage founders want to hear about. Welcome to the Retail X podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Retail X Series podcast. I'm your host, Sapna Shah. In today's episode, we dive into the world of accelerators. Are they right for you, and how do you choose one? Our guest today, Jackie Trebilcock, is the Managing Director of New York Fashion Tech Lab. Welcome to the podcast, Jackie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited to be here and to tell you more about New York Fashion Tech Lab and all the different programs that exist.
Great. So let's start with a little bit more about you and the New York Fashion Tech Lab. So tell
Sure.
us a little bit about your role, a little bit about what New York Fashion Tech Lab does, kind of what its focus is.
Sure. So I run the New York Fashion Tech Lab, which is a nonprofit that focuses on women-led B2B fashion and retail tech startups. And it's actually part of a larger organization called Springboard Enterprises. And they've been around for 20 years supporting women in tech in different sectors like life science and biotech and media and ad tech. Really impressive organization that has worked with over 800 women who've gone on to raise over 10 billion, 20 IPOs. And they realized back in, it was around 2013, early 2014, that they were not seeing the types of technology they were seeing in other industries in the fashion industry, or cut to today, more of the retail industry. So they decided to launch this specific program in 2014. And I run this for them in New York City. And we run the program just once a year. And the mission is similar, where we're focusing on women-led companies and helping them to make connections and advance. Springboard's more of a venture catalyst, so their main mission is to connect women in for capital, and we do that too, but we're more of a business catalyst, where we're also working to connect these fashion retail tech companies, or emerging tech companies, as we call them, with large retailers and brands.
Great. So you mentioned something about you run one program a year. You run a cohort once per year. So
Right.
and I think you're about to start that process now as we're kind of speaking towards the end of 2020. So as you're doing that, kind of starting with the process that you're going through to find the companies for each cohort, what are you looking for and how does that selection process work?
Yeah, so we do run it just once a year. A lot of programs do two or sometimes more cohorts a year. However, we're just operating currently with the one traditional program a year. We do some other ancillary programs a lot for our alumni community and different regional events, but the core program is once a year. Traditionally runs spring, summer, and I can kind of walk you through the process and what we're doing all year for that is one, since we are propelled by retailers and brands, we always are taking the time to meet with them and understand what are their pain points and ultimately signing them on to be a part of the lab. So we do that each year. And then we open up applications, which, as you mentioned, we're just about to do now for 2021. And we're specifically looking for, as I mentioned before, B2B women-led fashion and retail technology companies that are beyond ideation, at the very least beta. So we're probably more specific than most programs because we have the requirement that there's a female founder or co-founder or a woman on the team with significant equity to be the point person. Also true B2B technology. And we also ask for it to be beyond ideation, at the very least beta, so that through the program, you're ready to work with these retailers and brands. And it's less about, oh, I have an idea, but more we're working with, it could be several retailers and brands already. And this is just a way for you to get in front of more. Or it might be that you have one, direct to consumer customer, but this would work for larger retailers and brands. So that's traditionally what we're looking for. And our process is that we take applications for several weeks and then review them with our retail and brand partners to ultimately narrow it down to a selection of finalists. The retailer and brand partners meet the finalists with us and with Springboard. And then from there, as a group, we narrow it down to that year's cohort, which could be anywhere from 6 to 10 companies. It's less about kind of filling seats and more about if there's a real opportunity for the retail and brand partners, then they would be selected. So our process is a little bit different than others in that sense that it's very specific to what the retailers and brands need, simply because that's the way that these entrepreneurs can get the most out of it, right? If the retailers and brands are interested, then there's a real opportunity for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, as you're starting applications, opening applications soon,
Mhm,
how long, from the time a founder applies to when they hear back if they have gotten a seat in the cohort, like how long
mhm.
does that entire process take?
Well, I'll speak to kind of two versions of that. One is the old world when we used to do a lot of things in person and the timeline was a bit different, and the new world where things are much more virtual, which does allow you to condense the timeline a bit. So, in past years, we would traditionally open the applications earlier than now. We're in December now, but we would open them usually in October and they would run through the end of the year. And then the retailers and brands would review them in January. We would host a finalist session in February, and then we would announce and launch in March. The reason for that time in between is one, we want to give the retailers and brands the opportunity to review. The other is that a lot of the entrepreneurs we work with, and even some of the retailers, are not New York or US based. So we need to allow time for them to travel in. So we used to require for that finalist session I mentioned, they had to be here in person. So they would fly in from all over the world to present and then leave. And then if they were selected, they would come back. So we needed to allow time in between. We don't fund any of that. And as I mentioned before, we don't invest or take equity. So it has to be an entrepreneur or company that is ready for that expense. And we obviously want to give them enough time to book efficient flights and travel and all of that. In the new world, things are a little bit more condensed because we don't have to allow time for travel. So we open up our applications a little later than normal intentionally because there's just so much happening and still being developed and still a lot of unknowns, particularly in our industry. And we plan to run the program on the same timeline, but haven't announced the official dates yet. But we plan to run it on spring, summer. However, we don't need to leave like months in between. So they could apply as early as this week and then not know if they're selected until spring. So it's
Got
a
it.
bit of a longer tail than some other programs, but it's really because of the way that we're doing it most thoughtfully with the retail partners.
Got it. That makes sense. And so, thinking about programs in general, I mean,
Mhm.
each program's process is probably a little different than the others, but what should founders be prepared with when they apply to a program like New York Fashion Tech Lab or even another one? Like, what types of questions should they be ready to answer? What do you like to see in that application?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we spend a lot of time with founders even before the applications open. So our process is we do a lot of the pre-vetting and initial calls before we push the application live. It is a public application, anyone can find it, but we're looking for something so specific and really want to get to know them in advance. And I think several programs do that, right? I think in particularly the current world that we live in where there's a lot of different programs and a lot of different opportunities, and founders really do have a lot of leverage to get to choose when is and what is the right program for them, which I think is awesome and very different from when I first started this work in 2014, where there wasn't as many programs. It shifted a bit to there's a ton of different ones, sector specific ones, some that invest, some that don't, some that are specific to women, some that are specific or more general to not specific to an industry. So there's really the opportunity to evaluate many. So I think the questions that they need to ask and what they need to find out initially is kind of what's the value for them, because they all have very different value propositions to bring forth. And I think the biggest thing that they should ask or think about is what's the time commitment, and what do they need to put forth, and what are the expectations. When we look at the applications, when we have them complete that, for us, we do ask a lot of questions. Our application is 50 questions, which I think is longer than most. Some of them are like very easy, like the name of your company and your website, and others are more focused on what do you do and why do retailers and brands need you, and what's kind of your biggest challenge that we can help you with. And in thinking about the best way to answer those, I have found many founders have told me that even if they don't end up completing the application because they decide it's not the right time, or even if they completed and aren't selected, it's a great exercise for them to actually sit down and look at this form or this questionnaire and have to fill it out and describe what they do very succinctly, because we have a lot of word counts and we don't allow them to write on forever. So it's a great exercise for them to try and hone in on what they do. And thinking about someone like myself reading it, who I know more than most and will probably look up every detail, to the retailers and brands that are reading it, who are really just scanning over and choosing the ones they like best. How do you best position yourself and your company to get their attention. And that's what we actually help them do. So once we send them the link to apply, we don't just say, good luck, hope you make it. I actually go and spend a lot of time in the back end of the applications and read them. And if it's a company that I've talked to and I know that they could explain it better, we'll tell them that so that they are best positioned. Because it is really hard to talk about yourself and your company.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think it's great that you do that. What I hear from a lot of founders is that, they're applying to like 3 or 4 programs and
Mhm.
they're just filling out an application and it becomes like a rote thing. But it seems like you really focus on that fit. Like, is there a fit between the program and the founder, which I think is great. And helping them kind of make sure that they understand that fit, I think is also really important.
It's really all about that. I think for all programs, not just ours, because again, back to timing, it has to be the right time. Like personally, professionally, I've, again, in doing this for so many years, talked to founders who are like, this is great, but I just had a baby, or this is great, but we're just finishing fundraising, or we just, moved and opened a new office in a different country. And a lot of it does have to do with timing and really understanding what they can commit to, and also is their company at the right stage. Looking back at some of the companies we've had in the lab, they've applied a few times, which does happen and is okay, because it is about looking at when could or would be the right time. And a lot of them have come back to us and said, this wouldn't have worked, 2 years ago when we really wanted to do it. We're glad that it happened now because we were really ready for it. So I think taking all of that into consideration on both sides, and hopefully the programs are also thinking about that as well. But my point is that it doesn't have to happen at that exact moment. There could be other opportunities because most of these programs are running yearly or bi-yearly or twice a year.
You a little bit alluded to this about, sort of the timing and the commitment, but
Mhm.
are there other important questions that founders should be asking of a program when they're going through the process that they usually don't ask?
Yeah, I think founders have gotten pretty good from my experience in having that leverage and asking the questions, which I think is great. We try to do calls with everyone, although all the information is available. I've done many sessions like this, and we've done videos, and we have links and one sheets. And it's really important to, I think, get on the phone if you can, and if it's offered to you, to make the connection and really for it's really valuable for me to learn more about what they do and vice versa for them. And I think it is important to do your due diligence. And although I say this, but I'm a little bit hesitant to, it is important to talk to the alumni, although it's always our alumni don't have time to talk to hundreds of people. It is important to, if you can, or someone that knows someone, or you can even some of the like mentors in the program, or what we call our expert network, some of them could give advice as to if they know the program. And some of, for example, in ours, the sponsors or retailers could give advice as if they know the program. I think validating that someone else knows a little bit about your company and can say like, yeah, this is a good fit for you is important. And of course, any recommendations or referrals from alumni could be helpful in understanding what their experience was or wasn't. But obviously saying that, knowing that it's hard for them to answer everyone. But unfortunately for a program like ours, now that we have so many alumni, it gets a little bit easier. It's not all on just like 2 cohorts.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think a lot of times some of that, what you spoke about how much time you'll have to spend or what the commitment
Mhm.
is, sometimes it looks different on paper than when you've talked
Yeah.
to somebody in one of the previous cohorts who's gone through it
Mhm.
and can really kind of give you the inside scoop.
Yeah, and I think it's also changing too with this whole digital virtual world. Ours was never where you had to like be somewhere every day. I kind of always say it's not startup 101 curriculum. That's ours. Others are where they require you to be in certain sessions and kind of work out of a space and show up. And that was never what we were. I'm curious with some of the other programs how that's changing going forward. The silver lining to all of this is it's so much easier to access things virtually, particularly for us instead of flying into another country in some cases. So I think it'll change a bit there. But yeah, it is important to understand what the commitment is and also what you're looking to get. So there's a lot of companies that I talk with that are really looking for that, help with their MVP and just kind of getting off the ground and finding a co-founder. And they do need that initial 100K for a small percentage. And we wouldn't be the program for them at this time, but likely next year we might be because they maybe went through another incubator accelerator that could provide them with that so that they're ready for a more focused program like ours.
Right. That makes sense. So you alluded to kind of the mentorship and the expert
Hmm.
network. Most programs do
Hmm.
offer some sort of mentorship. How
Yeah.
important is that as, as if I were a founder kind of looking at a variety of programs, how important of an element is that mentorship? And should founders be, kind of assessing who those mentors are ahead of time?
Yeah, I think it is important. It's kind of one of the key features of these types of programs, right? And the reason that it's important is the way that I position this overarchingly to a lot of founders is this just is a way to increase your network personally and professionally. In the industry in New York, if you're, if that's not kind of where you came from or your world, or even if it is, we can always benefit from meeting more people. However, we are very conscious of not just having our founders take meetings for meeting's sake and trying to be really thoughtful in the matching. We don't really even use the word mentor because I think that sets like false expectations. It's more about how can you meet with this person, understand what they do, allow them to understand what you do, and then see what happens. Maybe there's a connection. We've had some really awesome stories come from some of the connections we've made, but if nothing more, give feedback and potentially make connections. So if you think about it as a way just to expand your network and kind of spread the word about what you're doing to people that are specific to the industry, which is why they're a part of said program, I think it can be really valuable. But I think it depends on how the program structures it for sure, because I have heard stories where people are just taking a lot of different meetings and then not sure what to do next. I also think it's on the founder to really keep a great log of those meetings and who you've met. Because what I've also seen is sometimes it's not the right time now, but you need to go back to them or remember them, or they could be another good conduit connector for you. So it's also on the entrepreneur to keep great notes about who they met with and as part of the program. And I've seen founders really excel at this where they are tracking all of it. We are too, but really they're tracking it so that they can come back to this and use it as a forever resource, not just a 12-week.
That's really good advice. I think, as you know, I'm part of the expert network at Fashion
Yes.
Tech Lab, but I also
Yes.
am like a mentor or whatever, whatever each program wants to call it, at a variety of
Hmm.
programs. And
Hmm.
I'm surprised at how many times founders don't keep that log and then don't
Yes.
remember when they're out ready to fundraise, for
Hmm.
example, that maybe they should
Yes.
contact me again,
Right.
because they weren't ready when I first met them. But I think that's such a critical piece of advice. I do think programs like this give you so much access to lots of different kinds of people,
Hmm.
but you might not be ready for all of them at that moment.
And usually you aren't. And we also position it that way, even for someone like yourself. I'm not connecting you with them because I'm trying to get you to invest in them today. I just want you to get to know them, see what they do. And then if you guys have a connection and if the founder is diligent about who she met with, she should come back to you and at least see if you're interested or maybe you have advice or connections for her. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that founders in any and all programs could be better about. But I also understand that it's a lot, right? This is all in addition to your normal life. You're running your company and now you have this obligation of a program. It does get to be overwhelming, but I always say you kind of get out of it what you put into it. So if you are going to do our program or any others, kind of make sure you clear some time to be kind of efficient about all of the meetings and networking and people you get to meet through along the way and through the process.
Absolutely. That's great advice. Switching gears slightly. So, most
Mhm.
programs end in some sort of demo day. Your program certainly does. So, what do
Mhm.
you see as the purpose of a demo day?
So I hate the word demo day, to be honest with you, but I don't know what else to call it. So we've tried to call it like tech runway demo day and come up with unique names. But I think for the purpose of it, it is an easy way to understand. It's a pitch presentation or a demo on stage. And but yeah, I don't love the name, but we do it. And it's kind of a nice way though to end a program in a sense. Although our program, it definitely ends, but we are always in touch and always kind of keeping up to date on the founders and there for as a resource for them, ongoing and for springboard, which they also become a part of kind of for decades. But for the demo day that we do, we used to host it in person. We would do it with InStyle magazine at their auditorium for about 250 people. Ours was never public. It was always invite only for retailers, brands, investors, and press. The reason for that is we wanted to make sure it was actionable for the founders and really provide them with a platform for exposure. That was the goal. Because although they've had 12 weeks of all these different meetings and exposure and feedback and all of that, how do we make sure that they kind of end it with another surge of excitement from retailers, brands, investors, and press? And that's was the goal. And that's usually what happens. So it's another kind of like ramp up where they end up getting a lot of additional follow-up meetings, re-engagement or re-excitement in what they're doing post that event. For 2020, we hosted it digitally or virtually, which actually worked out really well because we only have 250 seats, I think, in the auditorium we used to use with it at InStyles auditorium, but digitally or virtually, we still kept it private and invite only and targeted towards those three groups of retailers, brands, investors, and press. However, we were able to have 500 join. So I think another silver lining is we were able to give more exposure. Obviously different, and we couldn't host a dinner the night before and to have a breakfast reception in the morning and demo stations afterwards, but I think we did make the best of it, and it ended up working out really well. So yeah, it's a long way of answering your question to say it's really for more exposure and also just highlighting the work that the founders have done. We're not asking them to announce anything. They can if they want, but it's really just allowing them a way to give a clean, easy, and concise presentation, which we help them with, to their target audience.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I think my guess is a lot of the demo days, for lack of a better word, may end up being virtual going forward, just
Hmm.
because you can get more people kind
Yeah.
of in the room, in the virtual room, than
Hmm.
in an auditorium for sure. We've talked a little bit about this, but I want to go back to kind of the alumni networks.
Hmm.
So, let's say you go through your program, founder goes through your program, they're now part of kind of the alumni cohort. How important is this? How much do the alumni cohorts kind of stay in touch? And should founders, when they're thinking about a program, should they look at this as one of the criterias to say, okay, yes, this program does X and Y with the even once somebody's kind of gone through the program as part of the alumni network, versus maybe another program that it doesn't do quite the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, you can tell a lot from the alumni. It helps you see like what types of companies that the program has worked with. It's an easy way to get a glimpse of just like the stage, or again for us like the criteria, right? Because they're usually on the B2B side. We do try to stay really involved with our alumni. The benefit of me having been doing this for so long and Springboard having been doing it for so long is like they can reach out to me anytime, text, WhatsApp, Slack, however they'd like to, and whatever they need, we encourage them to reach out to us. They're fundraising or hiring or looking for new retailers or brands or have questions, and we can really facilitate that. And I do that a lot, right? If they're have a question about maybe they're working with a certain retailer or at a certain fundraising stage, and I know we have 58 alumni that have gone through the program, I pretty much know them all personally and can say, you should talk to and make those connections. So ours is a bit unique because we're so involved in that way. Similarly for Springboard, right? Their president and chairman have been doing this for 20 years. And if there's a broader question that's not specific to the industry or we want to open it up, we can go to that alumni network. And we use a lot of different tools to kind of manage that and keep them in touch. So I think it's kind of I haven't seen that the alumni are always, there's times when they're really active on their own because they're in all of these different groups, but a lot of it is us reminding them and saying, who you should talk to and here's who you should connect with. So we do a lot of that. I think also less so much about the network because that's really reliant on each other kind of building that. We do a lot of events and things. We've done events. We did an alumni experiential once where we were just trying to highlight the alumni that had been in the program, because part of what I get asked all the time is what's up with so and so, or how's this one doing? And so we were like, let's just have them all at an event where people could come, primarily retailers and investors, come and see what they're up to. And we did something similar, highlighting just a few of them in Los Angeles last year, and we'll be working on other things like that going forward. My point being that it's not just about the network, but what else does the program do for the alumni to highlight them? In our case, we're not investing or taking equity in them, but it is in our best interest, and we really do want them to succeed. So it doesn't just stop at 12 weeks. What else are they doing to make sure that you are top of mind?
Right. Yeah, that's very helpful. That's a helpful perspective, which sort of leads me to my next question, which is that completing a program like New York Fashion Tech Lab, for a lot of founders, they think that it's maybe being part of that alumni network might be helpful, but most importantly, it'll make fundraising easier. Do you think that that's true, that being kind of completing a program like yours affects the startup's fundraising process or can be helpful in fundraising?
I don't know if it makes it easier. I think it could affect it or could be helpful. Back to the point about even just the expert network or mentor network, if you're using those connections, you're kind of one step ahead, right? Because you've already met them through the program. We also do a lot of like investor pitch sessions too, in addition to just the network. And also, I think back to your question about alumni, asking for introductions and telling, if you went through the program in 2015, you're fundraising now, let me know so that I can think of who I know that I could connect you in with. So I think from that perspective, it could be. For our program specifically, I think the reason that investors are interested is because the root of it is the retailers and brands choosing these companies. It's not really myself or Springboard selecting them. And I think investors take note if the retailers and brands are interested, they obviously want to also understand why. So all of those things and the exposure that you get can of course be helpful. I do think there's some sort of a validator for certain programs. I hope ours is one of them, where when you see that logo on a deck or you hear that they were involved or see when you like look them up, that it means something. And of course, we had companies that have raised money through connections made in the program for sure, and we can track that. But I think it definitely can help. It just depends on how you use it and what stage you're raising and where you're raising. Obviously, we might be able to be more helpful in New York than if you're only fundraising in Asia.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you've alluded to this as well. You don't take equity
Hmm.
in these companies.
Hmm.
Instead, you charge the founder a fee to be in the
Hmm.
program.
Hmm.
Many programs do take equity. Do you
Hmm.
think one of these models is better than the other? And kind of what advice would you give to a founder who's kind of assessing, should I be in this program that takes equity? Should I pay
Hmm.
for this other program? Like, how do you choose?
Yeah, that's a good question and something that we're really upfront about and talk about a lot. So the reason we don't invest or take equity is because we're a nonprofit, so we can't do that. And Springboard, as I mentioned, has been operating for 20 years, running these programs, charging the founders a very small nominal fee to participate. The reason we charge the fee is not, it doesn't actually help us fund the program in a sense. We're doing that through the corporate sponsorship. It's just to make sure that they have some skin in the game, right? To make sure they're as invested as we are. And it just helps gate it a little bit because otherwise any and everyone would just apply. And then if they got in, maybe they participated, but something else came up, who cares? They wouldn't be incentivized to continue. So that's
Right.
why we have that. I do think depending on where you're at, that it could be more founder friendly, right? Because it's just much cleaner and easier. And a lot of the entrepreneurs I talk to are like, oh my gosh, we'd much prefer that versus having to then have you on our cap table and deal with all of that. However, the companies that are again are looking for, I'm just generalizing, that 100K for X percent, they need that. And that's really important to them. And that's going to kind of help them get to the next level. So I think it's very personal as to what is needed. And also for our program, I'm kind of speaking to what it was in the old world, a small fee and also having to travel to New York. If you're from, we've had companies from Singapore and Russia and Switzerland and Israel and London and Paris, and it's not cheap to fly in and out of New York. And if that wasn't something you could do, then this wasn't the right program for you. I mean, going forward, it'll be virtual until we can all gather again. But I think those elements are something that also organically helps you figure out what program's best for you. So I don't know that there's a one answer of what's better for everyone. It really just depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think it's interesting that you kind of talk about that kind of fee as a skin in the game, because that leads perfectly to my next question, which is that I've seen a lot of founders now, and this was maybe not true back in 2013, 2014, when New York Fashion Tech Lab first got started, but I've seen many founders who've been through a number of programs, right? They'll
Hmm.
go through some that require equity, some that
Yep.
don't. It might be some like kind of back to back or with a year or two in between. Should startups do more than one program? Like, is there an ideal number, especially when you see in an application process that they've done some other programs? Is that kind of a good thing or a bad thing in your mind?
Yeah, it's definitely something we've seen in the last few years. And I would say wasn't, to your point, something that we saw a ton of in 2014 or 15, but now it's more common. And most of the companies in our lab have gone through other programs, Techstars, Y Combinator, there's so many. So I think it's pretty common. And depending on where you are in the stage of your company, you probably went through something early and then maybe something else once you are kind of at stage 2 or 3, and then maybe our program before or after. So it is really common. It's not anything that we think of it as negatively or one way or the other. I do look at like, when did they do all of them? I've definitely seen founders have gone through a ton of programs. You're like, wow, that's a lot. How did they do that?
Mm.
But usually there's some reasoning behind why or how they've done it, or kind of what they got out of it. So it's much more common before. And I do remember, like I said, maybe like 2016 or 17, really first thinking like, oh my gosh, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Like, why do they need all of these different programs? But they really are now so specific. And that's more of the trend. So, and of course, as we have found more global applicants, when you open that up to the world, there's more programs all over the world, and some are specific to just different like service providers, or some are specific to different retailers. So there's so many ways to do it. I think it becomes a good almost validator too, right? That there is some sort of a selection. It is vetted in some sense. So it can be a positive thing for the entrepreneurs, and not something that we think of as negatively at all. I do think, and we try not to use the word accelerator, incubator for what we do, just because that can sometimes imply that it's like an earlier stage company. Whereas we're dealing with like early growth stage companies, we try to think of our program more as like a business catalyst, business development play, so that we're not just lumped into all accelerators or incubators. But essentially, that's what we're doing.
That's sort of some helpful perspective. I agree with you. Like I see so many, on pitch decks
Hmm.
when founders are sending them to me, I see so many programs listed, and sometimes I'm like, really, how
Yeah.
much do you have time for all these?
Right.
What does your cap table look like?
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's some good advice. Okay, I want to wrap up with one last question. I mean, you've given so many sort of tips and advice, but sort of, what's the one piece of advice you would give to founders who are now kind of assessing these various programs and, maybe are choosing their first or second? Is there anything that really sticks out to you as this is the one piece of advice you should really take to heart as you're kind of going through the process?
Yeah, I think it's really just doing the research, right? Looking at what the programs offer, back to all of the points we mentioned about, is it taking equity? Is it investing? Do you need that right now? Do you not? Understanding the timeline of it, when is it happening, and can you really go all in at that time? And then also thinking, does it run annually? Is it twice a year? Is this the time, or is next time the right time? I don't encourage you just to apply to programs and see what happens and using that as the way to vet it for yourself. I think the way we look at it is, we don't want you even to fill out your name if you're not serious about it. You don't really feel that it's the right time, because that's just wasting our time too, right? I'd rather just get to know you and keep in touch. So I think doing the research, like we mentioned, if you can get a call with a program and ask your targeted questions versus just reading everything that they post on their site, if you can access some sort of validation from alumni. It doesn't have to be talking to them on the phone. It could be, a lot of programs capture quotes or videos about them, is helpful. If they did record their demo day, maybe ask to check that out too, because you'll kind of see the quality of the program, the quality of the entrepreneurs and how they present themselves. And if you feel that that is where you want to be, or that you're already close to that, that could be a good way to evaluate if it's the right type of program for you.
That is all very great advice. Do your research for sure.
Hmm.
Maybe this entire podcast should be called "Do Your Research."
Right.
Because that's basically what we
Do
talked
your
about here.
research, get phone calls, reach out to people. But yeah, I think that's the most important piece, because they're people that know the ins and out of the programs, like yourself, right? I'm sure if there was a founder that asked you, you know enough about these programs from being involved and meeting companies from them, that you would have a perspective that they may not have thought about. So I think that obviously they need to make a decision for themselves, but definitely ask others that have some knowledge of the organization or program.
That's great advice, and that's a great place to end it. Jackie, thank you so much for sharing all about New York Fashion Tech Lab and kind of how you see this world of programs evolving for founders, all your advice and your tips. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being so supportive of the lab and being involved. And I can't wait to share who the 2021 companies are.
I'm very much looking forward to that. And thank you to the listening audience for listening to this Retail X podcast. We'll have another new episode out shortly. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to attend a Retail X Series event, check out www.retailxseries.com for upcoming virtual events and recordings of past events. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Retail X Series. You can also learn more about me, find fundraising resources, or submit a pitch deck at www.redgiraffeadvisors.com. Thanks, and catch you next time.